Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that first pillar, about the supporting families. The cornerstone of that is the child tax credit. Now, the child tax credit is unique in that it has, in general, bipartisan support. I mean, it's a credit that's been around for a while. The Republican tax cut bill in 2017 doubled the tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000 per child. It did some other things as well. But then the Democrats' COVID relief bill earlier this year expanded it once again. Now, granted, both provisions were temporary, right? The Republican tax version extended the child tax credit to 2025, and the Democrats' bill just to the end of this year. So the complicating factor here is how to design a child tax credit, given that you've got all these fiscal cliffs, and obviously trying to make something like this permanent is going to be very expensive, because not only are you trying to extend the changes that the Democrats made to the child tax credit, but you're also trying to make permanent the Republicans' change. So given that it's really, really expensive to make the current design permanent, and given that there is some bipartisan support for something perhaps in the middle, what is in your opinion, what is sort of the sweet spot for the child tax credit? What is like the ultimate child tax credit look like to PPI?
Sure. So I think one important thing to remember about the Republican child tax credit is it wasn't a straight tax credit expansion. They partially offset the cost by making changes to personal and dependent exemptions that existed in the tax code before the tax cut bill. And so they had this whole package expire in 2025. It wasn't just the child tax credit expansion. And so an argument that we have been making to Democrats is we could take those middle class tax changes, which I think we actually mostly support. Those are the provisions that are generally supported. And we can make those permanent along with the expanded child tax credit. And that reduces the net cost of our expansion, the one that President Biden signed this year, to $800 billion over 10 years. I think that's a lot more realistic and plausible than just a straight expansion, permanent expansion of the child tax credit. From that point, I think it's worth considering, is there a possible sweet spot in the middle? I would rather have a smaller but permanent and fully refundable child tax credit so that low-income families get the full value of it. That's where most of the poverty reduction, but less of the cost comes from, is that full refundability. I would rather do that than have the tax credit at exactly the current levels that we do. And then within that framework, there's also room for other changes. So for example, right now you get a flat $3,000 a year benefit for older kids, but it's $3,600 a year for younger kids. And there's an argument that younger kids need more support, they're more expensive. And especially if there's a risk of losing something like the child care subsidies, there should be more support for younger kids. And so one idea we've put out there is to maybe do, a $2,500 tax credit for older kids and a $4,000 tax credit for younger kids. You can play with the levers. So, if you define younger kid as 3 and under, that's even more money that you can give to the younger kids. But I think that approach makes more sense than, just a straight extension of the current 3,000 or allowing it to expire.
Got it. Another cornerstone of the Progressive Policy Institute policy proposal is climate change. When you're moving legislation via reconciliation, we've heard people talk about the bird rule a lot. We've talked about it on this show. It's something that sort of constrains what you can and cannot put in a reconciliation bill. There's some concerns that some of the climate change proposals that have been put forward may not pass the bird rule inspection and may have to drop out. Then there's also the question of Senator Manchin from West Virginia in the Senate, obviously a very coal-friendly state. He doesn't like the climate change proposals that are currently under consideration in the reconciliation bill. So my question is we all know that climate change is an issue. It's something that we're behind the curve on. It's something we need to do something about. But how do you get climate change into the Democrats' reconciliation bill? What does that policy look like that passes both the Byrd test and the Manchin test?
So before last week, the main policy, there are two main policies components to the Biden climate agenda. The first was a package of tax credits to encourage the adoption of electric vehicles and other renewable energy sources. And the second is what's known as the Clean Electricity Performance Plan, also called the CEPP or the CEP. And that was meant to incentivize utilities to adopt more renewable energy. The CEP was a version of a previous proposal, the Clean Energy Standard, that couldn't have passed through reconciliation. The CEP is designed to do this through sort of a payment and penalties structure for utilities that Democrats hope will be able to pass the Byrd rule. And I think that given the work that has gone into that policy, that's still sort of the clearest, easiest path forward is to try to find a version of the CEP that works for Senator Manchin and for climate activists. Now, earlier the last week, there was reporting that talks could be breaking down there, and there aren't the CEP might fall out. So one of my colleagues, Paul Bledsoe, and I actually recently published a piece in The Hill this week, sort of offering two possible routes for a climate compromise. The first is to adjust the CEP to try to meet Senator Manchin's concerns. The two concerns he has stated the most are that he thinks it might give heavy subsidies to utilities that are already transitioning towards renewable energy. And the second concern is the impact that this would have on West Virginia. And so, and because it wouldn't allow technologies like coal and natural gas with carbon capture to qualify, and that's a big important component for him. So one option is to try to adjust the CEP so that the subsidies are lower, maybe cap them, and change the standards so that carbon capture sequestration could qualify. If that approach doesn't work, we propose sort of an alternative structure, which is a carbon price. One of the big obstacles to a carbon price historically, you still have some of those issues with a coal state. So what we propose is that instead of just raising the revenue from a carbon tax and rebating it directly to people, which is sort of one of the most common proposals, we would only do that with half of the revenue. The other half of revenue we would give to states to make sure that no state is paying more in carbon tax than they're getting back from the government, so that it's not a net transfer of wealth out of states like West Virginia.